The rain hammered down on the gray asphalt as a woman in her late 40s, Linda Carter, parked her car outside a quiet suburban home. Her hands trembled slightly, but it wasn't from fear. It was anticipation. She had waited 20 years for this moment. 2 decades earlier, her life had unraveled in a single afternoon. Linda, a devoted wife and mother, had returned home to find her husband, Michael, packing a suitcase. His face was pale but resolute, his eyes refusing to meet hers. "It's over," he said coldly, ignoring the cries of their 5-year-old daughter clinging to Linda's leg. Linda had begged, pleaded, but it was no use. He left that night, and with him went her stability, her family, and her future. Michael had fallen for another woman, a confident and cunning real estate agent named Rachel Monroe. Rachel was younger, polished, and utterly ruthless. Linda had heard whispers about Rachel, manipulating her way into deals and ruining marriages to climb the social ladder. But until that moment, Linda never thought Rachel's ambition would destroy her life. The years that followed were nothing short of brutal. Linda worked 2 jobs to support her daughter, Emily, while Rachel and Michael lived a picture-perfect life in their sprawling new home. Emily grew up angry and distant, resenting her father's absence and Linda's endless struggles. Meanwhile, Rachel's name popped up in the local news as a woman who had it all. But fate had its own plans. 10 years into their marriage, Michael died in a car crash. At his funeral, Rachel wept as though her heart had been shattered. Linda stood in the back, watching silently. It didn't feel like justice. It felt like an empty conclusion to a story she hadn't finished writing. After Michael's death, Linda vowed to rebuild herself, not for closure, but for revenge. She took college courses at night, eventually landing a job at a private investigation firm. Over the years, she followed Rachel's life with surgical precision, uncovering her dirty secrets. Rachel, it turned out, wasn't as untouchable as she seemed. Her wealth was built on fraud and blackmail, her professional reputation propped up by bribes. Linda collected it all, documents, testimonies, and photographs. But Linda wasn't content to simply expose her. She wanted Rachel to suffer, to feel the weight of every decision that had destroyed Linda's family. The final piece of her plan fell into place when Linda discovered that Rachel was desperate for a new investor for her failing luxury real estate business. Posing as an affluent widow, Linda gained Rachel's trust, becoming her financial backer and closest confidant. Over the course of months, Linda fed her false hope, dangling the promise of millions to keep Rachel afloat. Then came the reckoning. One crisp autumn morning, Rachel arrived at her office to find it swarmed by federal agents. Linda's evidence had made its way into the right hands, exposing Rachel's years of tax fraud and embezzlement. Linda watched from her car as Rachel was escorted out in handcuffs, her once flawless face twisted in humiliation. For Linda, the moment wasn't triumphant. It was quiet. She didn't feel the elation she had imagined for so many years. Instead, she drove home to Emily, who was now a grown woman starting a family of her own. Linda had finally broken the woman who broke her family, but she realized something deeper. True victory wasn't in revenge. It was in surviving long enough to rebuild what had been lost. Linda Carter thought the chapter was closed as Rachel Monroe disappeared into the justice system, her empire crumbling overnight. Months passed, and Linda allowed herself small victories. Her daughter Emily's wedding, a peaceful Sunday morning with coffee in hand, and the soft light of normalcy that she had fought to reclaim. But the shadow of revenge is long, and it rarely leaves as quietly as it comes. One rainy evening, as Linda locked up her modest home, she felt the weight of an unshakable presence. Her instincts, sharpened by years of pain and survival, made her pause. A low hum of tension filled the air. She glanced toward the driveway and saw a figure standing under the streetlight. A woman. Rachel Monroe. Her hair was unkempt, her once pristine designer clothes replaced by a cheap trench coat. Her eyes, once sharp and calculating, were now hollow, but seething with fury. Linda's breath caught in her chest. She hadn't anticipated this. Rachel, broken but not defeated, standing at her doorstep like a ghost of the past, refusing to die. "Linda," Rachel called out, her voice raw and unsteady. "We need to talk." Linda hesitated. Part of her wanted to shut the door and call the police, but another part of her, a darker, more curious part, wanted to hear what Rachel had to say. She stepped onto the porch, keeping her distance. "What could you possibly have to say to me?" Linda asked, her voice cold but steady. Rachel smirked bitterly. "You think you've won, don't you? You destroyed everything I had. My career, my reputation, gone. But let me tell you something, Linda. You can't erase me. You can't erase what I did to your life. And you're not innocent in all this." Linda folded her arms. "Is that supposed to scare me? You deserve everything that happened to you, Rachel. You took my husband, my family, my peace. You built your life on lies, and I just shined a light on the truth." Rachel stepped closer, her face illuminated by the flickering streetlight. "You think exposing me makes you better? All you've done is become me, calculating, cold, ruthless. We're the same now, Linda. That's the real tragedy here." The word struck Linda harder than she wanted to admit. Had she become the monster she spent years despising? She shook the thought away, unwilling to let Rachel's venomous manipulation seep into her mind. "You don't scare me," Linda said firmly. "You have nothing left to hurt me with." Rachel laughed, a low, bitter sound. "Don't I? You're forgetting how much I know about you, Linda. About your daughter, about your past. You think you can just close the book on this? Think again." The air grew heavier as the two women locked eyes, a silent battle of wills crackling between them. Linda, ever the survivor, felt the urge to end this once and for all. "Stay away from my family," Linda said, her voice sharp as steel. "Whatever power you think you still have, it's gone. And if you come near me or Emily again, I'll make sure you regret it." Rachel tilted her head, a dangerous glint in her eyes. "We'll see about that." Then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, Rachel turned and walked into the darkness, her silhouette vanishing into the storm. Linda stood there, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She had destroyed Rachel, but Rachel wasn't gone. The past had a way of clinging on, and Linda knew that her final confrontation with the woman who broke her family was far from over. This time, however, she wasn't afraid. Linda Carter had survived 20 years of pain, and if Rachel Monroe wanted another war, she'd be ready. The uneasy peace didn't last long. Rachel Monroe wasn't bluffing. Linda Carter began noticing subtle but deliberate signs that her enemy was creeping back into her life. It started with anonymous letters slipped under her door, each one filled with cryptic warnings. Then came the more invasive gestures. Emily's car mysteriously vandalized, strange calls in the dead of night. And one evening, Linda returned home to find her living room window shattered. Linda knew it was Rachel. She also knew Rachel's tactics hadn't changed. Intimidation and manipulation, the same tools she used to steal Michael years ago. But this time, Linda wasn't the vulnerable woman Rachel once preyed upon. She contacted an old colleague from her days as a private investigator, a man named Frank Morrison. Gruff but loyal, Frank agreed to help Linda figure out what Rachel was planning. "You think she's trying to scare you?" Frank asked as they reviewed the evidence one evening in Linda's kitchen. "No," Linda replied, staring at a photograph of Rachel from years ago, her confident smirk frozen in time. "She wants control. She wants me to feel like she's everywhere, watching, waiting. It's her way of proving she's not beaten." Frank tapped his pen against the table. "Well, she's sloppy. If she keeps this up, we'll catch her in no time. Leave it to me." But Linda couldn't just leave it. Rachel's threats had awakened something inside her, a determination not just to defend her family, but to end Rachel's games for good. It wasn't until a week later that Linda got her first real lead. Frank had tracked Rachel to a dingy motel on the outskirts of town. It seemed Rachel had burned through her remaining money and was living in secrecy, barely scraping by. But the discovery didn't bring Linda relief. It brought unease. Why would a woman like Rachel, once so proud and resourceful, stay in one place for so long? Frank followed up, planting a surveillance device in Rachel's motel room. What they heard chilled Linda to the core. "I don't care how risky it is," Rachel's voice hissed over the recording. "I want her to pay. I'll destroy her piece by piece until she has nothing left. You owe me, and if you don't deliver, I'll make sure your secrets get out too." Linda clenched her fists as the recording played. Rachel wasn't just targeting her. She had enlisted someone else. A shadowy accomplice with their own vendetta. "Who the hell is she talking to?" Linda asked. Frank frowned. "Don't know yet, but I'll find out." The answer came faster than Linda expected. One night, as she was locking up the office where she now worked, she noticed a figure lurking by her car. She approached cautiously, her hand gripping the pepper spray in her bag. The man turned to face her. It was George Ryder, a former client from Linda's private investigation days. She had exposed his involvement in a major insurance fraud scheme years ago, costing him his career and nearly landing him in prison. "What are you doing here?" Linda demanded. George sneered. "Returning the favor. Rachel told me all about you, how you wrecked her life. Guess you have a habit of ruining people's worlds." Linda took a step back, her pulse quickening. "So what? You're working with her now?" "She gave me a chance to even the score," George said, stepping closer. "And trust me, Linda, I'm going to enjoy this." But Linda wasn't the same woman she had been 20 years ago. She reached for her pepper spray and unleashed it into George's face. He stumbled back, cursing, giving Linda just enough time to run back into the office and lock the door behind her. The next morning, Linda and Frank went to the police. Between the recording of Rachel's threats and George's failed attack, they finally had enough evidence to take action. The police raided Rachel's motel room, arresting her and seizing her phone, which contained a treasure trove of incriminating messages. Rachel Monroe was charged with harassment, conspiracy, and aiding George Ryder's attempted assault. Her remaining accomplices scattered, unwilling to risk further exposure. As Rachel sat behind bars, Linda visited her one final time. Separated by a thick pane of glass, they stared at each other in silence. "You never knew when to quit," Linda said at last. Rachel smirked faintly, though her eyes betrayed her exhaustion. "And you never knew when you'd won. You're still here, fighting battles you've already won." "No," Linda replied calmly. "I'm here because I don't run from what's mine to protect." Rachel leaned back, her smirk fading. "You and I aren't so different, Linda. You'll see it one day. Revenge has a way of sticking with you." Linda stood, her expression resolute. "I'll take my chances." As she walked out of the prison, Linda felt lighter. Rachel's reign of terror was over. And for the first time in 20 years, the past no longer had a hold on her. The long game was finally over, and Linda Carter had won. Years passed, and the storm that was Rachel Monroe became a distant memory. Linda Carter rebuilt her life for the last time, this time with a sense of peace she had never known. Emily, now a mother herself, often brought her young son to Linda's cozy home, filling it with the laughter and warmth that Linda had once feared she'd lost forever. But Linda hadn't forgotten. She didn't dwell on Rachel or the years stolen from her, but she carried the lessons in her heart about resilience, about survival, and about the thin line between justice and revenge. One crisp spring morning, Linda stood in her garden, tending to the roses that had become her passion. The radio played softly in the background, the news reporter's voice blending with the chirping of birds. And in other news, former real estate agent Rachel Monroe, infamous for her role in several high-profile scandals, has been released from prison after serving a 5-year sentence. Sources say Monroe has moved to an undisclosed location to start a new life. Linda froze, the pruning shears in her hand hovering midair. A familiar unease crept into her chest, but she forced herself to breathe. Rachel's chapter in her life was closed, and Linda wasn't about to let it reopen. She turned off the radio and returned to her work, the roses bright and full of life. Months later, Linda received a letter in the mail. It was a simple envelope with no return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Rachel's. Linda hesitated, the weight of the years pressing down on her, before finally opening it. Linda, I suppose you thought you'd never hear from me again. I don't blame you for that. But prison gives you time to think, to reflect. You won, and I've made peace with that. But there's something I need you to know. You're not the only one who lost something. For all my mistakes, for all the damage I caused, I loved Michael. Maybe not the way you did, but in my way, I did. I've lost everything now, and I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that. Take care of yourself, Linda. You're stronger than I ever was. Rachel Linda sat with the letter for a long time. She felt no triumph, no vindication, only a strange, quiet sadness. Rachel's words weren't an apology, but they weren't meant to be. They were a final admission of humanity from a woman who had spent her life trying to prove she was untouchable. Linda folded the letter and tucked it away in a drawer. It didn't matter anymore. Rachel Monroe was just a memory now, one that had no power over her. Years later, Linda Carter's garden flourished as a testament to her resilience. Her grandson played among the flowers, his laughter filling the air as Emily called out to him from the porch. Linda watched them with a soft smile, the weight of the past finally gone. She had won the long game, not by breaking Rachel, but by surviving her. And as the sun set on her peaceful little home, Linda knew that for the first time in decades, her life truly belonged to her again. The story was over, and Linda Carter, at last, was free.